I know that recognizing today as Indigenous Peoples Day is something that the president felt strongly about personally. He's happy to be the first president to celebrate and to make it the history of moving forward.
The president's actions today writes a new chapter that embraces Indigenous knowledge, ensures tribal leadership has a seat at the table, and demonstrates that by working together, we can build a brighter future for all of us.
For the first time ever, a U.S. presidential proclamation marks Indigenous Peoples Day, recognizing the sovereignty of Native American tribes and the treaty obligations of the federal government of the United States. Hello and welcome to Inside America with me, Ghida Fakhry. Joe Biden has become the first sitting U.S. president to issue a proclamation commemorating Indigenous Peoples Day, which has traditionally been marked across the United States as Columbus Day, honoring Christopher Columbus, the explorer, who was also a brutal colonialist. In the proclamation issued by the White House, Biden described the contributions of Indigenous peoples throughout history as, quote, an integral part of the American nation, culture, and society, while acknowledging the significant sacrifices made by Native peoples. The president also acknowledged the death and destruction inflicted on Native communities after Columbus arrived in North America in 1492, saying it is, quote, a measure of our greatness as a nation that we do not seek to bury these shameful episodes of our past, that we face them honestly, we bring them to the light, and do all we can to address them. Fulfilling a pledge he made as a presidential candidate, Biden restored protections for 2 national monuments in the state of Utah, a step that was praised by Deb Haaland, the first Native American to serve as a cabinet secretary.
Today's announcement, it's not just about national monuments. It's about this administration centering the voices of Indigenous people and affirming the shared stewardship of this landscape with tribal nations. Thank you, Mr. President, for the profound action you are taking today to permanently protect the homelands of our ancestors.
Meanwhile, a bipartisan bill known as the Native American Voting Rights Act was introduced in the U.S. Congress. The new legislation would let tribes determine the number and location of voter registration sites, polling stations, as well as ballot drop boxes on their reservations, bar states from closing or consolidating those sites without tribal consent, and require states with voter identification laws to accept tribal ID. Will this bipartisan bill become law? Joining me now is Congressman Raul Grijalva, who has served as the U.S. representative for Southern Arizona in the U.S. Congress since 2003. He's also chair of the House Committee on Natural Resources. Congressman Grijalva, 5.3% of the population in your state, Arizona, is American Indian and Alaska Native. In your district, there are close to 40,000 Native Americans and Native Alaskans who could be impacted by the Native American Voting Rights Act if it is passed by the U.S. Congress. It's obviously not a top priority for Congress at the moment, which has been dealing with the risk of a government shutdown and debt default, but it was co-sponsored by a Democrat and a Republican, 2 of only a handful of Native American lawmakers on Capitol Hill. Just how likely is it to pass?
I really believe that it has a lot of strength, Ghida. When we talk about Indigenous people in this country, we have to talk about it with the context of history. And it wasn't until the late 1940s that American Indians and Alaskan Natives got the right to vote in this country. And so, yeah, there's a lot of urgency, particularly when issues of our democracy are at stake. Everybody should participate, and certainly the first Americans should be have not only the ability, but the access and the right to vote. And I think this act reinforces that, makes it plain, codifies it into law, and it should happen. And I think there's a lot of good momentum for it. And I would hope that in this second part of our session, we get that done.
But realistically, though, given the very limited political representation of Native Americans at the federal level within Congress, and the huge economic interest and influence of the oil industry on decision-making in Washington, how likely is this to happen?
I think that dynamic has changed. I think that paradigm has shifted somewhat, considerably. Beginning with, I think the Native people, indigenous people in this country, whether it be tribal or independent of tribal governments, have been in the last decade and intensified in the last 5 or 6 years, been much more active and effective in terms of extending their sovereignty rights, self-determination, and the protection of cultural resources, and their fight on climate change. They've been at the forefront of those fights, and I think I think that's the momentum nationwide, and I think that's why they have the support that they have.
You mentioned the issue of sovereignty and the protection of cultural resources. As chairman of the House National Resources Committee, do you believe that Congress should remove the economic barriers that face the indigenous communities? Should they be allowed to develop their own resources? Because obviously impoverished communities within reservations and other places where these communities live could use the oil money, couldn't they? And according to a Department of the Interior estimate, these undeveloped resources of coal, natural gas, and oil could add up to $1 trillion. These are resources on tribal lands. They could give them up to $1 trillion in revenue. That's a huge sum.
And with that, and I think part of self-determination is economic self-determination, not just gaming casinos. But I say that in the context also of that we're fighting a brutal battle against climate change and the climate crisis, and it affects indigenous communities because of they're poor and the lack of resources even more so. We saw that during the pandemic, and so. Yeah, I think that's part of the definition of self-determination, but I think also they're part of the solution on the issue of climate change. Just to begin to extract for the sake of extraction and not realizing what damage it is doing to communities and to the planet itself, I think that needs to be taken into consideration. And I'm very confident tribes, given their track record, would take that into consideration.
But will Congress ever remove these barriers? Will tribes be allowed to develop their own resources?
I think that's where the initial point that you made about the influence of lobbyists, the extraction industry, multinational corporations, and the lust for that part of territory that is undeveloped, that's when that comes into play. They would like to reserve the right for them to be the captains of those decisions and deny it to tribes. Yeah, that'll be the most difficult hurdle we have, is not so much that it's not the right thing to do, because it is, that it is going to be resisted not by tribes. It's going to be resisted by multinational corporations that want those natural resources for their own purpose.
And of course, there are other big hurdles when it comes to the voting process. As you know, there's a lack of trust among indigenous communities in the voting process, accusations of voter suppression. In your own state, Arizona, there are renewed concerns among the indigenous community that a recent Supreme Court ruling, which upheld 2 of the state's restrictive voting laws, will further suppress indigenous voting rights in Arizona. Just how concerned are you that minority voters, indigenous voters, are being targeted?
That's it's a self-fulfilling question, and of course I'm concerned. But the issue is that that is the struggle that it's an issue of democracy as much as anything else. Voter protections that the House passed, Indigenous Voting Rights Act that the House passed, are sitting in the Senate and not being acted upon. That's where I think movement and attention has to be placed. That both those to end that suppression state by state, to protect voting rights on a universal level, nationwide, under federal law, I think is the way to go on both issues. And until we do that, and until the Senate moves that, we're stuck with one state, Arizona, whether it be Texas, whether it be Georgia, that initiates laws to suppress and make the process of democratic voting by those that are eligible difficult, if not impossible.
And of course, many of the Native Americans living on reservations have to travel for hours to be able to vote. They also face identification restrictions because their ID tribal cards aren't given the same weight as federal and other state identification cards are. There's also the issue of ballot collection, where some within the indigenous communities who cannot vote themselves rely on neighbors and friends and colleagues to deliver their votes. There has been a ban on this since 2016. How restrictive is all of this? Because many activists believe this all follows a pattern of voter suppression. They say the treaties that the federal government signed with native tribes to protect the sovereignty of tribes to govern isn't being respected.
Well, I don't have an argument against you, because you're right. That's what's going on. And there's a voter suppression that it targets poor people, communities of color, indigenous people, and it targets it because somehow it has been construed that this is the enemy by the people that are passing these laws. And that's why the two pieces of legislation sitting in the Senate, as the Senate ponders whatever the Senate ponders, are so essential.
All right, thank you very much, Congressman Raul Grijalva. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
For decades, Native American communities faced disproportionate barriers to voting. Despite the passage of the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, many Native Americans living on reservations remained excluded from the American democratic process. As a result, voter turnout for Native Americans is the lowest in the country, with about 1 in 3 eligible voters not registered to vote, according to the National Congress of American Indians. Tara Houska is a Native American activist and lawyer who's been lobbying the U.S. Congress for basic services and human rights for Indigenous peoples for many years. In her 2017 TED Talk, she highlighted some of the issues facing her community.
We face this constant barrage of unteaching the accepted narrative. 87% of references in textbooks, children's textbooks, to Native Americans are pre-1900s. Only half of the U.S. states mention more than a single tribe. And just 4 states mention the boarding school era, the era that was responsible for my grandparents, my grandmother and her brothers and sisters having their language and culture beaten out of them. When you aren't viewed as real people, it's a lot easier to run over your rights.
Tara Houska, tribal attorney, former advisor on Native American affairs to Senator Bernie Sanders, and member of the Ojibwe tribe, joins me now. Tara Houska, you were born in Minnesota, one of the states where Native American voters have become an important bloc, a voting bloc, along with Arizona and Michigan. When you consider that 1 in 3 Native Americans are not registered to vote among the 34% of the population that are eligible to vote, what do you put it down to? Is it apathy? Is it a lack of trust in the system, lack of resources, or outright voter suppression, as some say?
I'd say it's a blend of all three. There are a lot of reasons to not trust the federal government when it comes to representation. Our representation has been sorely lacking since the founding of this country. The respect for Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous autonomy has not been present. And we are people who are largely forgotten in the fabric of the United States and in Canada. And on top of it, there's also a lot of hurdles when it comes to voting, when people do want to get out to vote. We've seen that manifest in places like North Dakota, South Dakota, and Minnesota and other places where there are substantial Native populations where we actually can flip a vote. Places like North Dakota where you saw, outright voter suppression happening because Native people oftentimes do not have addresses. We do not have IDs that are considered ones that are commonly known. Tribal IDs are federal IDs, yet they are oftentimes not understood. So it's a lot of different factors.
And of course, the Native American community is one of the fastest growing demographics in the country. The number of people who identify today as Native Americans or Alaska Natives, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, grew by 27% over the last decade to 3.7 million people today. Now, you've spoken over the years about the trauma of Indigenous peoples trickling through the generations. You said, quote, centuries of oppression, isolation, and invisibility has led to a muddled understanding of who we are today. How do you correct this muddled understanding of who Native Americans are?
I think education is foundational to a lot of these issues and struggles that we continue to have. Most people have no clue who we are. They get a very, very short, brief description of Native people that's pre-1900s, typically in a U.S. textbook. They're not familiar with the tribal nations that are surrounding them, always. Like, everywhere is Indigenous land, and there are Native people all over the whole of Turtle Island. And that is kind of made worse by the representation that does exist, which is oftentimes sports mascots, really racist, old, nostalgic notions of these kind of fallen warrior savages that no longer exist, or the sad, pitiable people that live on reservations and have no money, or are really rich from casinos, or go to school for free, or don't pay taxes. There's a lot of misunderstandings which could be easily corrected by education.
And you say, Tara, that it's really hard to be in these shoes, to stand here as a product of genocide, survival of genocide. You say when you're not viewed as real people, it's a lot easier to run over your rights. Many years ago, I know you moved to Washington, D.C. to work as a tribal attorney, to lobby for basic government services. What did you learn about the way Native Americans are viewed on Capitol Hill, in the corridors of power in Washington, and how has it changed, if at all?
Oftentimes, it was an incredibly backwards and ignorant understanding of who Native people are. This really misinformed understanding of Indigenous sovereignty, of Indigenous nations. And in places where there was more understanding, oftentimes it was just dismissal, outright, unless the tribal nation had more lobbying power, more dollars, more access. It was this kind of afterthought. Or you'd see efforts by, let's say, the Obama administration to fully fund some of these services that are guaranteed by the treaties that created the United States, and then Congress gutting those appropriations and halving the budget. So yeah, a failure to uphold even the most basic rights that are guaranteed. These are not special rights. These are rights that were paid for this country to exist.
Tara, Houska, thank you so much for joining me. Pleasure to speak with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
There's over 567 tribes that are federally recognized in the United States. There's several hundred more that are not recognized, that are usually recognized by the state. There's over 300 different languages. This is just in the United States. This doesn't count Canada or Central America or South America. And yet, we're supposed to accept these things as an honor. In fact, these people have no context to what we are and who we are, so much so that they believe that they're not just honoring us, but that they are carrying our legacy.
So how is Indigenous identity depicted in American culture? Joining me now is Gregg Deal, a Native American artist and activist. He is a member of the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe. Gregg Deal, you say that as an artist, the only way to function is to work within the boundaries of what the West and Western cultures expect. You say there's no context to what a Native American person is. There's no value for our stories, you say. What happens when you don't conform to these stereotypical depictions of Native Americans in Western culture, when you don't fall in line with the Indian cowboy narrative?
I think there's an inherent risk that is associated with that. We are talking about sort of a majority perspective on what Indigenous people are and how they're supposed to look and act and talk and present themselves. And so trying to readjust those narratives can be incredibly difficult in the face of narratives that are just supplanted within popular culture.
And just how do you readjust those narratives? I know you once said that you discovered through your work and activism that the value of Indigenous peoples is really low in the eyes of Americans and American culture. How do you
I
address
think
that? How do you tackle the invisibility and misconceptions of Indigenous identity?
I mean, you continue to push, not compromising what those images look like, or how I present those images myself. But overall, we're seeing changes happen. I mean, there's two Indigenous sitcoms on television right now with Indigenous writers, uh, comedians, writers, filmmakers, artists, dancers, musicians. I mean, all of these things are coming up into the mainstream. So we're beginning to see change happen already. And I think there's multiple people and multiple mediums that are helping to make that happen.
Are we seeing enough change, though? Because on Indigenous Peoples Day, I looked through the Washington Post. I couldn't find a single piece about Indigenous people.
Yeah, I mean, the invisibility is real for sure. We are seeing more of it, but I think that we need to make space. The United States, if not Western culture at large, needs to make space for Indigenous people, and I think this is also paramount in terms of whose homelands are we on. You can tell that settler colonialism has gone full circle when the Indigenous people of these lands are looked at as foreigners, and so we need to fix that. We need to allow not just the voices of Indigenous people, but the authority of Indigenous people to resonate throughout these lands so that there's an understanding of whose land you're on. That's going to take a fair amount of reconciliation and accountability for the United States to really bring those things to the forefront. So I think the question ends up being, is the United States ready to bring that accountability to the forefront?
Is it ready, do you think? And what shape should accountability take? It should go, I presume, beyond the proclamation of Indigenous peoples' rights. Should it take the form of an explicit apology, reparation?
I think apologies are just words. I mean, I lived in Washington D.C. for almost 17 years, and I actually sat on a Senate for a Senate committee for Indian Affairs, of which John McCain was over at the time. And I heard him say in that meeting that we owe an incredible debt to these people. This is the same person who worked into a bill that he put in to take away a sacred space from the Apache people. So no, I mean, and is America ready for accountability? No, I don't think that America is ready for those things, but I also don't think it matters if they're ready. Accountability needs to happen. Change needs to happen. I think the authority of Indigenous people who have a vested interest in their homelands should have a say on the things that happen on their homelands, and the recognition of people who were here before colonialism that predate America have a right and should have a right to ultimately invest in these spaces and help along the amount of information and the way information is being given. We should be participating in what education looks like. We should be participating in higher levels of government. We should have more authority in these spaces because these are our homelands.
Gregg Deal, thank you so much for making the time.
Thanks for having me.
The history of the United States of America has several layers of colonial rule. While the US War of Independence against Great Britain marked the end of one such layer, although it was more of a conflict between Europeans over taxation and British-French imperial rivalries, it hardly compares to other decolonization cases when Indigenous peoples, natives, freed themselves from the shackles of colonialism. In what is today the United States, up to 15 million Indigenous peoples are estimated to have populated the land at the time Christopher Columbus, quote, discovered the Americas in 1492. Of course, the term discovery is part of the gross falsification of that history and the masking of genocidal crimes that were hardly recognized by governments in the United States and elsewhere. By the end of the 19th century, after innumerable wars and murderous raids by the US government on indigenous tribes, less than 250,000 Native Americans remained, expropriated from their ancestral lands, confined to, quote, reservations by treaties, in return for promises of self-government, basic services, and economic prosperity. None of those promises materialized. Today, the few million Native Americans living in the US remain a caste, languishing and largely forgotten on desolate reservations. I visited one of those reservations many years ago and spoke to some of the tribal elders whose children and grandchildren continue to live in extreme poverty, plagued by environmental disease, alcoholism, and opioid abuse, the legacy of decades of neglect and hopelessness. So in short, Biden's proclamation of Indigenous Peoples Day is an important symbolic step, but hardly sufficient. While the US is trying to come to terms with slavery, the effects of which still reverberate today, the genocidal crimes against Native American tribes have absconded America and Americans unless you are the forgotten descendants of 250,000 Native Americans, survivors of a brutal European conquest of America. That's all from me, Fakhry, and the team here in Washington. Thanks for watching.